Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Welcome to Perugia, welcome to the International Journalism Festival 2018. We're here to talk about culture change. It's something that I think all of our media organisations are facing at the moment. The digital change is already several years old, but we are by no means through the changes that we need to make. And the three of us, Fiona Campbell from the BBC, Christina Johannesson from SVT, and Jane Barrett, me, from Reuters, have been working specifically in how to change our culture, how to change our companies from the inside out for at least the last couple of years. So we hope that we have some useful tips. We hope that we can share some stories, and we very much want to hear from you, questions, and to have a conversation. But we're going to start this morning with Lucy Kueng, a research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, who did an excellent piece of work last year called Going Digital. And if you haven't yet read it, I thoroughly recommend that you do. It has some incredibly practical ideas and some good challenging ideas as well to get moving some of those people who may be a little more resistant to change, shall we say, in your organisations. So to start with, Lucy is going to take us through some of the key findings. And then we will have a bit of a discussion and interactive debate around some of those issues and what we've been doing about them.
Great.
So Lucy, over to you.
Fantastic. Yeah. Hang on, how do we get this full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, so this is a big piece of research I published in November. And the idea behind this research is essentially there's two simultaneous transformations happening in the media right now. One is in terms of content, and I have absolutely no doubt that the media journalism profession, with a deep commitment to great content and serving audiences, will master that transformation. But it became incredibly clear there is an additional transformation, a parallel transformation that needs to happen in organizations in order to make sure that those organizations producing journalism stay viable, that they have a real future. And that organizational transformation, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, is very painful. And what I tried to do with this work is look at what is best practice in terms of how organizations are changing. So that was a very big piece of research, 70 interviews, 14 companies I went into in depth. The big issue, there were two big issues that came out, and one of them was the challenge of culture change. And this is a kind of boomerang. I mean, when the internet first hit, culture was an issue. It's now come back. So what I'm going to do in this first kind of 6-7 minutes is give a quick overview of the key findings from this research, kind of like top line structure in where does this culture issue change hit, and how are really strong organizations, legacy organizations, how are they attacking it? And then we're going to move on to my three colleagues, all of whom are leading really interesting and intriguing and successful change initiatives in terms of their organizations. So I'm kind of giving a bit of architecture from a big group of organizations, then we're going to delve in deeper. Culture is really, really intrinsic to organizations. So the starting point, I think, for understanding why culture has become such an issue is to look at the nature of legacy organizations. And in the last few years, we've got very, very seduced by Silicon Valley. Lots of management techniques have come in from Silicon Valley. We've become very, very obsessed for good reasons with the platforms. But I think it's worth looking at where legacy organizations stand. And that's a very different place from Silicon Valley software-based technology companies. And, this is the report, by the way, and it's available for free. It's very short, 10,000 words, lots of bullet points, lots of citations, but it's free on the Reuters Institute website. Most legacy media organizations have progressed in stages over the last 50 years or so. They all started off as mass media organizations, a relatively simple product for mass audiences. One product fits all, portfolio product. So if you look at the 1950s, they were relatively simple organizations. Technology was also relatively straightforward. Product was relatively straightforward. In the 1980s, they added a kind of niche layer into their businesses. Newspapers started adding supplements, magazines, Broadcasters added niche channels, mid-1990s, legacy media added on website, on-demand levels, so their businesses are getting progressively more and more complex. And then obviously 2007-8, with the launch of Facebook, the iPhone, we added the mobile social layer. So you have organizations that have got progressively more complex. They haven't exited the layers below. The layers below are often still keeping the lights on financially. You can't get rid of them. But what that means for really long-established organizations is that they're arbitraging resources, attention, investments across all of these layers, and they've got to make sure all these layers talk to each other. And they're doing that against a background of growing poor relatively fast in some cases, and they're competing against new players who are just dealing in one or two of these layers. So their new competitors have the luxury of focus and a lot of resources. So what does that mean? It means, yeah, as audiences, we've had a massive increase in choice, but the starting point for legacy media is very, very complex organizations, stretched resources, and a real need, and this is the real cultural shift, organizational shift. The historic strengths and assets are still focused on the legacy layer, and the real challenge, the future, is up at the top. And the big challenge for organizations is moving the center of gravity up. And that's where the culture pressures start to come in. And then on top of that, this transition journey is becoming a very old story. Most legacy media have been trying to make this transition for over 2 decades now. So this adds another layer of complexity. So essentially, most large media organizations have some degree of tech debt, unfinished major transformation projects that are still lingering, that haven't brought all the benefits they were meant to. Secondly, for the individuals leading those change processes, there is a real risk of burnout. There's an awful lot of very highly skilled people exiting the industry simply because this process of moving the center of gravity up the organization is so exhausting. And this burnout, I think, is a real issue for those driving change projects and for those working on the boundaries between the old and the new. It's relatively easy if you're just in a digital pure play. But if you're in a legacy trying to add a pure play layer, life is very hard. Secondly, thirdly, this is actually the Demogorgon from those of you who saw Stranger Things Series 2. You know, there becomes a split in the community. Some people have seen the Demogorgon and some people haven't. Those who get it really understand how weak the position of legacy media is, how they grew up in a world being dominant players and they're now minnows, they're tiny fish if you look at the resources that people are now competing against. And that's also very challenging for the change leaders. They understand the scale of the challenge, but not everyone's got it. And the fourth point, which I know Fiona's going to talk about, is this internal, it's very easy to get sucked into the challenges of the internal transformation and miss the point that there's a really profound change happening in terms of markets. You can get into a kind of organizational bubble. So I think those are the kind of 4 issues in terms of where the organization is coming from. And those are really, those 2 slides kind of show what the culture change challenge is becoming. So what's happening in terms, one other thing. Big shift in knowledge hierarchy in legacy media. The big change is that expertise is no longer automatically correlated with how long you've been in the industry. There is a situation, we have a situation now where some of the most critical knowledge in the organization is now in the newer areas of the organization, in the lower levels of the organization, at the peripheries of the organization. It's no longer the case you've been in the industry 30 years, you have the best expertise. Some really critical expertise is in new places. And therefore, for leaders, you need to build a culture and a structure, and I'll come into the fact that culture is embedded in other things, that optimizes information flow. It's really, really important. All of this critical information and expertise is flowing around the organization. And that has really big implications for the type of culture you build in terms of openness, in terms of changing hierarchies, and so on. So I'm just going to move quickly into kind of top level of what is the culture change looking like. The big cultural tension that seems to come up in the companies I spoke to, and some organizations are doing much better than others in terms of solving it, is the tension between technology and journalism, which is a kind of no-brainer. So I tried to visualize this here. If you take this blue bubble as the culture of journalists, the occupational culture, the values that journalists as a profession share, and the orange one is the value that people coming up from tech share. They are very different. So journalists tend to have a background in the liberal arts, in words, in thoughts. Tech is more about numbers, it's about pure science, it's about engineering. So different kind of root disciplines. In terms of their focus, journalists are about serving audiences, protecting public values. Tech really have an equal obsession, but it's about perfecting the product. It's about perfecting US, perfecting the experience. So it's a more kind of pragmatic focus. And journalism has had to be risk averse. And I mean that not in terms of brave investigative reporters. I mean this is a profession that has developed with technologies where you had to get things as perfect as possible before you press the publish or the broadcast button, because it was too expensive, too painful to correct afterwards. Whereas in technology, you have a basis of experiment. We're all used to, updates in technology. It's not a problem. But what I saw in the organizations that are performing well, and this happens a lot through embedding, which I'll come up to later, is they get over this potential tension in the culture by working on the similarities. And what happened in very clear at Shipstead, very clear at Washington Post, New York Times, FT and so on, is that the points of commonality are both tech and journalism prize clarity of language, clarity of thought. Both are essentially craft professions. They want to perfect the product for their audiences, and both have very high intrinsic motivation. People enter these professions because they love the role, they love what's being created. And essentially, cultural synthesis, dissolving the tension between these two cultural groups seems to work best when you build on these similarities. Now, just coming on to how you change culture, what was really clear is, ironically, you change culture actually not by trying to change culture. You don't launch a culture change initiative. What you do is you launch a series of programs that are integrated, and that with the net goal of trying to change the overall culture. It starts with the leadership. You have to have incredibly clear messaging from the leaders of the organization. This is the problem we face, this is where we want to go. And that's really it's not 80-20, but that's about 60%, 50% of this whole culture change game actually relies on the leader. And that's why the people leading this stuff, their role is so incredibly important. After that, it's learning. It's setting up a program of continuous learning inputs coming into the organization, new inputs. Because this field is changing very fast, there isn't a core body of knowledge that has to be acquired, and once you've got that, you're ready to go. The field is moving very fast. A lot of flexibility in structures. I'll look at that in a bit later, but that's about also ensuring that skills can synthesize and learning can move around. And then smaller issues, channels, to ensure that knowledge can flow around, and building prompts, culture change prompts, into the new systems you're putting in place. And those elements together are what create the culture change. If we look at how that what is it? A few details here before I move on to my colleagues. In terms of leadership, communication is absolutely central. And as a leader of this kind of work, you are never not communicating. You are never in a neutral communication state. Everything you do is giving a message. And what I saw in the companies I spoke to was a lot of very overt communication, so very frequent town halls, very smart newsletters, jokey newsletters, witty newsletters, but really stressing behavior we want, behavior we don't want, values we're after, values we're not. But also, probably equally significant, a lot of kind of implicit, subcutaneous communication from leaders. So meeting choreography. If you have a meeting, what's at the top of the agenda? You move digital to the top of the agenda, and you move legacy down to the bottom. Job titles. So the Washington Post took digital out of all titles because everyone is digital, trying to remove the idea that there's a then and a for. And in terms of ensuring information can flow, it's really important. There is a risk with these transformations that leaders never hear if things are going off track, because people, they're checking in regularly, they get their KPIs, yes, it's fine, and then suddenly they hear a message, actually the entire X team is planning to leave because they're so frustrated. So you need to have very good mechanisms that they can connect with the other layers of the organization they don't normally get in contact with. And what I was finding coming up in the stronger organizations was reverse mentoring. So smart young digital people actually mentoring senior people, trying to explain what's going on. And a lot of kind of informal micro events where leaders had breakfasts and suppers regularly with people they wouldn't normally come into contact with, and creating a venue where they could honestly explain what's going on, a sort of low tense, an untense environment where people could really explain what's going on. And these are just some comments where essentially the message from the people I spoke to is that you think everyone should know this, you think they've got this message, they really haven't. You cannot under-communicate the core change message. In terms of learning, just a few tips of what I came across. The biggest thing in the strongest organizations, and this applies to some real industry leaders you'd think don't need to do this, very porous boundaries. Frequently, I'd go and do interviews in some organization. They say, oh, the Washington Post is coming in later for lunch and learn. Do you want to stay around? So lots and lots of people, essentially, the legacy media are incredibly open to talking to other legacy media firms and sharing experiences, and smart companies are taking advantage of that. Secondly, as I said, continuous learning inputs. And what I'm seeing was there were a lot of high-level inputs. So there are some fantastic programs, the Sulzberger program at Columbia, executive management programs at Harvard and INSEAD and Stanford, trips to Silicon Valley. But some really interesting kind of DIY, low-cost, completely scalable learning initiatives where I think Axel Springer had this brilliant thing where great investigative journalists, maybe a bit, established experience, would do mutual learning with the video teams. They would learn how to do video, and the new people doing video for Snapchat or whatever would learn what the real ethics and challenges of proper investigative journalism. So kind of Vox has its own internal university. A number of them have putting together internal do-it-yourself learning projects within the organization. And obviously, every time you do that, you're kind of shifting boundaries, you're loosening the hierarchy, you're building links between the organization. And as you all know, kind of creativity, innovation, it's not to do with the close nodes, it's to do with the weaker ties. And what you're doing with all this is building up weaker ties with people that have valuable information. Embedding, really clear. The first stage in new learning is embed, is training, but after that you try and embed the skills together, and then you really get synthesis. And the other thing that's very clear is you keep expectations really realistic. Not everyone has to know everything. And people will self-select. They know. I mean, I think it was Axel Springer found some very interesting people who are interested, say, in video journalism, but not everyone needs to know it. So that's just some quotes there. So just to close up from my part, the big shifts I see in terms of what has to happen in culture. Firstly, for legacy organizations that have been leaders, it's really important to make people understand that leadership in one era does not automatically mean you will lead in the next. And in fact, the more successful you were in one era, the lower the likelihood of transferring that leadership position, because you get complacent. It's all about the culture. If you have a culture of success in one era, it's really hard to dissolve that and build a new culture. The second one, which I think is really why this learning and flattening hierarchies and improving information flow, the challenge of finding a sustainable business model for quality journalism is so profound. The odds are stacked so hugely against classic media organizations with a heritage of journalism. It's everyone's challenge. You cannot, even great journalists cannot afford to leave this to the business people. Everyone has to be involved in finding the solution. Everyone has to be involved in making the tech work, getting more into touch with users, understanding how the world is changing. And the last thing is technology is absolutely intrinsic to everything. It has gone, that's the big story in the media industry. It's gone from being the support service, the plumbing, to being intrinsic to the ability to understand audiences, intrinsic to the ability to do great storytelling. And that's really, I think, probably the really profound shift that needs to happen. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, Jane.
Super. Super. So we're going to go into 20-25 minutes of conversation between the three of us with some input, I'm sure, from Lucy, to tackle some of those things head on, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion with the group. So I think we'll start off with the big issue of culture, kind of what is it, what are the good things, what are the bad things. So I think just to kick off from our personal experience here, there's a lot that is really good in our culture. So you want to build on that rather than going for wholesale change. I remember when I turned up at Reuters, I had it drummed into me that Reuters was about speed, accuracy, and freedom from bias. And those were values that I could definitely adhere to and aspire to, and I still do in this digital transformation. And I think that's been one of the kind of key things, is that, as Lucy was saying, you don't go on a culture change program, but you start to shift things using what's good before that you can build on. But I'm interested to hear from the both of you, kind of what in your cultures has been maybe less good, some behaviours or some habits maybe that have grown up that less good that you wanted to change and you've had to work on changing.
Well, if I start, I work at the BBC, which is obviously a public service broadcaster, which is a massive global footprint. And on the good side, everyone that works at the BBC really believes in journalism, really is committed to the work they do, and will go the extra mile in the field, in the office, anywhere in the world to make their story the best it can possibly be. And really that is what helps me in the change that I am trying to bring about inside the corporation. And my challenge was very much about audiences, which we'll get into later, but our need to balance the audience so that we served women, served men, served a younger audience, and served the less well-off, so people on lower incomes, all equally. Now, on the flip side, the reason why I needed to have that challenge and drive that challenge is that the BBC has obviously been around for a long time, nearly 100 years, and over time it has its default voice is perceived to be for an older, male-skewing, well-off, i.e. highly educated audience. This is in the UK I'm talking about at the moment. And that was a default voice, a default way of making content that it permeates the building. We're talking, as I say, about nearly 100 years. And with that, going back on Lucy's slides, the BBC is huge. It has evolved. It developed digital channels, rolling news channels. It has, umpteen radio programs. So it keeps on layering on new forms of output and content, without reorganizing at the core before it adds on again. And we're in that phase again in the digital world. So when online first started, the BBC website's 20 years old, they just take a team, they put them in a floor, and away they go. So there's another team that has to be communicated with, another team that has to be organized within the vastly complex web that already exists. And that is very difficult to organise and reorientate towards a new content challenge, which for us, as I say, was about the female audience, the young and the less well-off. And on a basic level, it came down to things like the 9 o'clock meeting. Where is digital discussed within the 9 o'clock meeting? How is it discussed in the 9 o'clock meeting? I could go into this in great depth. I won't. You can ask me questions later. And also things like we have a breaking news priorities list. One of the first things when I got my job was to try and begin the conversation to redefine the breaking news priorities list so that when journalists were in the field, digital had to be driven much further up that priority list because it was unbelievably low down, and it was a very complex set of conversations, many conversations, because there's so many bits of the BBC to be had to get that document redefined and reissued, which we did do, but it took a very long time, exactly because of what Lucy's saying, the layering on endlessly through an organisation. So that organisational chart and the way comms flow around a complex organisation are unbelievably difficult. I could bang on for an hour in itself in that, but the key to breaking that, and this will be my last point, is completely about communication and establishing webs of communication that aren't up and down. They're kind of, it's all around, you know, and you know, it flows in a way that never has flown before, and that's what's kind of helped us get some things moving. But anyway, let Christina reflect on that.
Let's come back to communication in a second, but I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that you made about audiences, because Christina, I think when in your transformation, it's been very much based on shifting a mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that we are not having challenges, because we are struggling like all of you, all of us, we are struggling in legacy media. But the mic,
Yeah.
You hear me now? Okay. Well, I was saying that at this point, SVT, the Swedish public service broadcaster, is growing digitally by 30% in a mature market. And at the same time, we're also actually growing a little bit in broadcast on a shrinking market. And this is a change that has come across over the last 2 years. And I think that the reason for that is partly the change of culture. We have had the privilege of maneuver that we could recruit new talent. And this is thanks to wise policy 15 years ago, because it's very difficult to fire people in Sweden. You basically have to steal from your employer to be fired. So for 15 years, we've been trying to reduce the number of staff so we can recruit people. But what we found is that if we don't change the culture and the digital literacy of all staff, we will not be able to attract talent or keep them. Because if you are a 25 really brilliant developer, you don't want to be banging your head towards TV stars that are not understanding what you're doing. If you can go and have fun at Spotify or Mojang or another tech company. So we needed to do something about everyone, and we did that by having different kinds of events like lunch speeches, where we brought in people from external and internal people talking about the change in society, the change in our industry, the challenges. So we had a number of different programs to do that. But I think the most important thing is that we asked the audience for help.
Should we choose the video?
I don't think I will show the video. Maybe I should just explain the project. For the last 2 years, we asked the audience to help us to become more relevant, to become more, to deliver news in the way that the audience need today. So hundreds of co-workers have been out seeing over 1,000 people all over Sweden, in all ages, all parts of society, the kayak club in Karlskrona to a choir in the south of Sweden, to schools and workplaces and sports associations, and really asked for feedback. What can we do differently? And do you think that the journalists at the beginning was very eager to go on these meetings? Not very, because many said, you know, I see audience every day, I'm out there talking to people. But the thing is, we don't talk to people in the way we do when we come to really listen. Because we come to see people when we do a news story, and we already have a picture in our head who they are. We work with stereotypes to illustrate a news story that we already have made up. So coming out without another agenda than to listen to people really made a difference. One of our most famous news hosts, award-winning, came back from one of these meetings all pale, saying, "Do you know what, Christina? They didn't know who I was." And that changes the way we talk in the newsroom. That changes the way we do prioritize our time. So this project has really been important, among other things, of course.
Yeah. Fiona, you've done a
Yeah.
lot of work with audiences. Would you like to share with people some of the
Yes.
pilots that you've done?
Yes. So, as I say, our change challenge was very much instigated by our need to find more female audience, to reach more female audience, to reach more under 34s, and definitely to reach the less well off, the people under mean incomes in Britain. So that's sort of the burning platform, the essence of, you know, what gets me up every day. So we have a digital pilot process, which I'll go into in greater depth, but essentially it's part of our change, and it's a team of about 6 people, and they go and sit with a specialist team, be it the health team, be it the entertainment team. At the moment they're with the 10 o'clock news, and they literally live with them for a month, and the beginning of that process is all about, this is the audience we want to reach. We want to reach more female audiences of any age. We want to reach the young. We want to reach the less well off. And how are you, as experts in the kind of journalism you do, going to do that? How are you going to talk to these people? And we have a 2-day away day process. Lucy will get the slides up, because I think some people might be interested. And we take them away for 2 days, which is a big thing in itself, because how on earth do you get journalists to break away from the news cycle for 2 whole days or a day and a half? And this is just a breakdown of the health team's away day. But a key part of that away day is we bring a section of the audiences in, like real people, in to meet the health team, let's say, or meet the entertainment team, or meet the education team, and sit down, and they tell them what they think of BBC journalism in that area, and what matters to them, what talks to them, what they like, what they don't like, right down to the imagery, right down to the headline, right down to whether they ever look at it at all. And that was completely a wake-up moment for a lot of those teams. So some of these teams were not necessarily all embracing of this process that we were running with them, this digital piloting process. But when they had the hour or the whatever with these audience groups, their attitudes changed, because they believe in the audience, they want their journalism to reach that audience, and this was a moment where they were like, wow, this is what these people really think of my work, and what I need, and this is what they would like to see my work do in order to be more relevant to them. So depends on your organisation, but interestingly, again, going back to that siloed issue, marketing and audiences and organisations do tend to be off to the side. You know, you may not be best friends with your head of marketing, you may not even know who they are. You need to find out who they are, and you need to make friends with them, because they are a brilliant resource. They invariably have bits of budget themselves, so our marketing department has to pay to find these people, to bring them in, and has been totally transformative for us. And it was a new set of relationships I had to build with working with our marketing experts. So I really don't think you can underestimate the importance of bringing that authentic audience input to the teams you're trying to work with. Yeah.
And it's been really interesting as well. I mean, from an agency point of view, obviously we have a consumer arm at Reuters, but the vast majority of our revenue comes from our professional clients, be it on the financial side or the media side. And last year, we launched a big project and plan to go out and visit and make sure that our salespeople knew the digital editors or the social editors at our major clients. Because before, when we talked about digital, the sense really was about the digital natives, the pure plays at the top of Lucy's chart. And it's really interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, journalists will be convinced by their sources. And so we were able to go back into our newsrooms and say, we have seen 66 clients, and more than 50% want this sort of news. You know, 35% of them now need video to be done like this. And no one could argue with it, because these were real people who pay us very real money, many of whom are probably sitting in this room right now. You know, and if we're not keeping up with the projects that our clients have been doing to know their audiences, and therefore for us to know what our clients need to appeal to them, then we would become irrelevant. And it's become interesting to see how data, so even though that's putting unstructured data together into some sort of structure, has been an incredibly powerful force for change. And again, it builds on the best part of the culture, which is, Reuters is run by 5 trust principles, as you might know, the 5th of which is one of my favourites, because it says no effort shall be spared to expand and adapt the news to maintain Reuters' place as the leading news organisation in the world. And so you kind of appeal to that core loyalty, but through data. I wanted to come back to something that you mentioned, Fiona, around communication. And I'd be interested to know and to discuss a little bit about how you get that messaging out, because again, I think that Lucy was saying, you can't over-communicate.
You are never
change.
not communicating, so whatever you do, whatever you prioritise, whatever you take your attention away from is a message, but also it's a kind of trope in change theory, but it's so true. You have to communicate 100 times more, really 100 times more than you think is necessary. You think you are so boring, how can this not still have got through? But it really hasn't got through. Because if it's a message that people at some level really don't want to hear, because there are, a lot of culture change is about power change, actually, deep down. It's very, very emotional because it's about a lot of people really giving away power to other people. And that's hard for all of us. And there's status issues, and actually for senior people in the industry, it can get quite existential. They can begin to see, actually, I have a sell-by date as well, and I'm approaching that. And that can lead to all kinds of, deep reactions that are not too positive for the organisation. So that's why you have the messaging from leaders has to cut across all of those very human instincts that are there. This is a very emotional process, but the emotions are kind of deeper down. So yeah.
So communication, I think just some observations, because I don't pretend that I've cracked this completely, but our division, mobile and online division, is 2 years old. It was started with new corporate funding, so it was a recognition from the top that having a mobile and online focus, it's around 300 odd people, was corporately very important. That was good. So and there was a hothouse to sort of set up the structure for it. And one of the things that came out of the staff feedback was we want more communication, which was interesting. So we started holding town halls. And the first town hall we held in the biggest room in Broadcasting House, it was like standing room only. And I was kind of overwhelmed, thinking, a lot of the people in the room weren't even from the division, which was interesting. There was a real hunger for knowledge. So as a result of that, we hold these town halls that are open to anybody every 6 weeks, which sometimes feels like Groundhog Day, because it's like, oh my God, I've got to say it again. But every time the room is into standing overflow, and every time people appear from radio, from places that aren't necessarily even connected to news. So I would say you can't underestimate the importance of regular communication. And in that communication, it's not about me banging on. Basically, some leaders from within the division, people who've been leading original content trials and experiments, get up, showcase what they've done, report back on what they've learned and what impact it's had on the audience with any data they have on it. And they share that, and people get real value from that. And a lot of the younger people who don't necessarily have a voice or have power or, are finding their way, they think that's a great access point for them, because it shows them who other people are in the organisation that they might go and talk to, what other projects are going on that they could maybe go and align with. So that has been really, really effective. And it's also been very good for showcasing new, young leaders who are doing things. So it's giving them a voice and giving them practice at standing up and showcasing their work. In alignment with that, we sort of do a fortnightly newsletter on some of the best content examples. It's another thing that's been interesting, because again, people who are far away, so in the regions or around the world, read that. So it's another access point for them. And at these digital pilot away days, so now nearly 140 people have been through this process. But as part of that, again, that sort of cadre of, you know, leaders or content experimenters come to that and present and talk. So it's all about trying to increase accessibility to people to share ideas that aren't, and it's not in a top-down process where the boss stands up and says it. It's the people who are actually doing it get to talk about people who want to learn more about it. But there's a lot of work involved in creating the staff time and space so they can meet to do this, and giving people the time to do it. And that cannot be underestimated, because again, we'll get into this. If people become overloaded because they're having to deliver too much, they get burnt out and tired. So
it's really interesting, though, isn't it? Because you mentioned emails. We were having a laugh the other day because we were having a laugh in the office the other day because one of the emails that I had sent out, I was given the open rate, and it was 10%. And my colleagues from PR were like, "Amazing, you got 10%." And I was like, I was so depressed, 10% only. But it was interesting because I've been sending out literally weekly emails for the first 2 years, and each one was just titled multimedia, and then something that I tried to make catchy, but clearly only got 10% reach. And it was interesting because that was just like a drum beat. So even the most hardened, change-resistant, I'm a financial journalist, this has nothing to do with me, reporters in the field knew that every Monday, or maybe Tuesday if I was a bit late, they would get something that would say multimedia, and that it was important, and it was ongoing, and it was not going to go away, and it was not a fad, and this is actually the way that we need to do things. And I think one of the things I learned through that was consistency. You know, that when you're leading huge change, you can't communicate too much, constantly, consistently. It's hard. People need to know where they're going in these things. And when you're trying to get different voices, which I think we've all been doing, it's been fascinating to me over the last few months, actually, just to see how some of the leaders who are maybe the hardest people to bring around, because as Lucy says, they were kind of thinking, hang on a second, this is existentially worrying for me, have now really got on board, but in their own words. Which is fantastic, because I don't want people to read out my script, because otherwise everyone will know it's just Jane's script. But we had, for example, the main news editor in Europe, Middle East and Africa last week sent out his weekly note, which I couldn't have written better. I mean, it was just awesome. I literally went up to him when it landed. I said, that's it. My job here is done. I'm off. Because he was owning the message. Or, our editor-in-chief, fantastic journalist and really into the journalism, when he writes an email praising digital-friendly journalism, everyone else starts to move. It's like the power of using the different voices for the right reasons. That person has the voice on that person, on praise. That person has the right voice for process. That person has the right voice for collaboration, whatever. And that's been really, really powerful, just to harness each person's character.
And I think that's really is the key to success, because you need to be able to combine those competencies. You need the experienced reporter and their knowledge, and you need the young technicians or the people bringing in new understanding about the media. And to be able to do that, you need to make them feel safe in talking to each other. Yeah. And you do that by constantly raising the understanding. For instance, with consistency, we have a competence blog where we update daily, for instance. And that makes people going from before the traditional television journalist could view these young people coming in. You didn't understand their lingo. You saw them as a threat to your job. And you have been here for 20 years and you know how things are done. So in this way, when you get to feel a bit more oriented, you are not threatened, and you can. And the other way around also, you need to find the respect from all parts to work well together, I think.
Well, and that takes us on to the other topic that we were discussing a lot before coming to Perugia, around training. And as Lucy was saying, you can do the top-down training, we're going to teach you how to do this, but actually so much of digital is having to be bottom-up. So I love your idea of like the investigative journalist sitting with the Snap team, you know, working out how to, why a Snapchat story. But let's just quickly, maybe let's make this the last part of the formal part, and then we can open it up for discussion. But what are some of the examples that you've seen really work of peer-to-peer training or skills increase, or as Lucy was saying, kind of that information flow?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, it's a matter of volume. I mean, we used to send a few really enthusiastic journalists to classes in Geneva, and then and expect them to come back and change the newsroom. And it doesn't work that way. The risk of burnout and frustration is really, really big. So now we try to bring in people that can teach a larger group, so we get like a wave of new knowledge into the newsroom, and that can make a change. And people can support each other in changing the way we work. So that's one way of doing it.
Fiona?
You know, I think volume is really important, because whatever you do, you've got to be able to scale it, because obviously we're all under an awful lot of time pressure. And I agree, it's not a case of just give somebody a course and off they go. That's just not enough. You know, in a busy news cycle, it's not fair on the individuals. You know, this piloting process that we've been doing, I highlight that again, only to sort of emphasize that it's taken a sort of crack squad of 6 people who spend a month living with a team, and in the run up to that month, they spend a lot of time doing one-on-one conversations with the whole team to find out what their issues and frustrations are, trying to get their journalism digitally through the BBC system. So, and then within that month, they try and deliver to them the training that each individual feels they need. So they don't come along and say, these are the 5 things we're just going to give to you and you're going to do it. We respond to what those people say they feel is relevant to them. But in parallel with supplying that training, what makes that, the 2 things I want to say that really I think has made that effective is, one, by being in a process that's a month long, they're leaders who are invariably highly experienced journalists who've been through many of those layer cycles of going from news to 24/7 news channels, you know, to really, you know, people who've been in the business a long time. I've witnessed them go on a leadership journey, which sounds crazy, but it's true. And they start to talk and communicate with their teams in a completely different way. So they start having different kinds of meetings at different times of the day, and they start to create the space for their staff to take advantage of the training that we have been supplying. So this again goes back to the importance of communication, because in legacy media there is a classic way to run a meeting. There is a classic meeting pattern in terms of the day, the week, that has always been, and they just rattle on like that, even though the meeting's probably rubbish. And and what we've been trying to do is unpick that and say, well, why do you have to have a meeting then? Why don't you have it then? Why does it have to be led by this person? Why can't it be led by you know, it doesn't have to be, you know, the youngest member of the bureau, but this is just one example that came up. And by doing that, people have felt they felt more creative, they felt more liberated, but the leader has gone on a journey where they've helped the staff, give them more time and space to deliver this new style of content. So, for example, the Brussels Bureau was amazing. The guy who leads that is amazing. And he has got to a space where he's going to send a team to Spain, or, you know, he sends them ideally 24 or 48 hours in advance of the news event, so that they can gather original digital content that is going to be for the female audience or for the youth audience, that's ready to go before they hit the news event, which would be the classic linear event on the day. So he came up with that system himself, But the joy of it, he has given his staff the time to do that content rather than expecting them to do it whilst they're doing the bulletins and breaking news and everything else, which never happens. So it's more than just delivering training. Again, communication, leadership, and changing your working patterns is key to bring it all together.
It's really interesting. Last year, the editor-in-chief gave me the task of making sure that every single journalist at Reuters, which is 2,500 full-time and about another 500 contractors. So I had to make sure that 3,000 people learned a second skill. And there was no way on God's beautiful earth that I was going to be able to do that myself. And so the way that we managed it was to get people in the bureaus to teach each other. So a photographer would hold workshops as to how to take good news photos that are good enough to make it to the wire. And we don't expect any of them to win a Pulitzer Prize, although you never know. And most of them are taken off an iPhone. But that had actually at least three different benefits. Firstly, we now have 3,000 people who are able to take decent news photographs around the world versus 300 regular photographers. So that's a tenfold increase. Secondly, people who knew their colleagues by waving at them when they came in or went out for a coffee or stood on the doorstep with each other now had a better understanding of each other's craft, because the photographers were also being taught and the VJs were also being taught by the text reporters what the key pieces of context and reporting were going to be needed for them to be able to write text to go with a visually led story. So it gave each other, all of the groups kind of had a new respect for each other's craft and a new ability to actually grow as a multimedia journalist, which is vital in the 21st century. Very few people now get a job if they can only report in one medium. But thirdly, it also allowed some of our photographers to think, you know what, that's good enough. You know, I don't have to hire a freelancer for 400 euros today to go and take those headshots. You know, the iPhone photograph was good enough, and that's fine. It's not going to be an archive use. It's not going to be something we put in the 100 top pictures of the year. And actually, good enough is good enough because, and I always quote this chap, Damir, who's our chief photographer in Beijing, and he was one of the real early adopters of this. And he said, I train the texties to go and take the photographs that they can so that I have the time to go and take the photographs I should. And I think, you know, why improve on perfection? So, but it's been interesting to see actually that the peer-to-peer stuff has been really important, just to get people's hearts and minds into it, as well as just the skills. And just the last point I would say on that is that as we did that, we realized that there was a gap. And the gap was actually the editors. And the editors were, as Lucy was saying, the people with all the experience of journalism, fantastically good journalists. And they could now take photographs or shoot video, and that was lovely, but they very rarely have the opportunity to do that. So this year we've started now, and it is more of a training course, but it's been very helpful to put them in the shoes of a client. So we just give them our content coming out and say, okay, yesterday's big story was Zuckerberg's testament, second part of the testimony. Build a website from the content that Reuters provided, and tell me, what do you wish that Reuters had provided? And what do you think that we could have done better? And what would you have liked to see? And just, again, like your Brussels Bureau Chief story, changing the mindset by getting people to think about how is our content being used in this day and age has been an incredibly valuable way of moving the needle. We have about 25 minutes left, so I want to open it up for questions. And I don't know, do we have a microphone to hand around for the questions?
And whenever you ask your question, can you just say who you are and where you come from clearly so everybody's aware? And wait till the microphone gets to you.
Okay, Jassim.
Hello, I'm Jassim Ahmed. I'm an independent consultant. I wanted to ask about how do you think the physical design of newsrooms and spaces, how can that impact cultural change, particularly when you think about across teams, across silos?
Can I answer that?
Go on.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll do one each so that we get around more questions.
I think it's absolutely key, and it's you know, the BBC has got sort of a cutting edge state-of-the-art newsroom, but already, you know, there's massive changes I would make to it. So, you know, for example, I think data visualization should be in the center of the newsroom, so you can't get away from how things are performing. It's in your face, whether you're a satellite truck engineer, or whether you're, you know, the court reporter that day. And we haven't got that. It's off to the side and it's not on. So therefore, unless you're on the digital team, you're not even, it doesn't beat in your heart. And also having a sort of core digital on team at the center of the you know, the news gathering ring, I think, is absolutely core. But we've just run out of space, so we can't organise it like that. So it's a complete nightmare.
Yeah, and that's the problem as well, is that we live in a two-dimensional plane, sort of flat. You know, kind of, we've just changed around our newsroom at Reuters so that we've got all the desks together. So in breaking news, everyone's actually talking to each other, which is radical. But we were literally, somebody was saying, well, couldn't we just open up the next floor up and have people sitting there so you can shout up and down? You're like, no.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dennis Redmond. I teach international media at the Graduate School of Journalism here in Perugia, embedded American, after a long career in the media. I would like to ask Lucy and the panel, for the very interesting panel, since the study in November, can you name names or situations, new things that have evolved since the study? And what are organizations that were really able to change their soul or their DNA, apart from your organizations, that have preserved the core, the 5 Reuters value, the BBC mantra, whatever, those that have really transformed their mantra and have survived? And finally, how do you fight against email and meeting fatigue?
Strong organisations. Hang on, what do we have? We had changes since I've done it, since the research was done. Oh, sorry. Changes since the research was completed, organisations performing well and dealing with kind of excessive bureaucracy and whatever. I said culture was one issue, people was one big issue that emerged from that. The other is just the sheer horror of the revenue challenge. And I think that is really underestimated actually by journalists who are facing profound challenges of their own. But for just about, it's really a wicked problem. It's really hard to see. You know, classic legacy media need a certain amount of scale to pay for the tech and find the journalists, and so they need those revenues coming in. And it's just a constantly shifting patchwork, and that is clearly continuing. So I think what we're seeing is, at a revenue level, the patchwork is changing. So a big shift we've seen the shift into subscriptions, we're seeing the shift into events, the whole kind of newsletter event silo focused area. Who knows how long that will be the case. The other thing that's coming in very big is AI. I'm seeing that, and actually the link between, you know, big data was the thing, but now this AI, I think, is really profoundly hitting, and it was really interesting in the Zuckerberg testimony to see how much he's now actually offloading the challenge in terms of controlling this content to AI. You know, AI is going to do this. Note, he's not going to employ people, which they don't want to do because people don't scale. But so I think those are the two shifts there. In terms of the organizations, I think the fundamental challenge is working out what is the equivalent voice in digital. You know, how do we take our unique personal handwriting that we had in legacy, our identity, and make that work in digital? And the organizations that are stronger are using more of the talents of the organization to solve it. I mean, the thing that really hits you, and you know, people were extraordinarily generous with their time, and I spoke to leading players internationally, and what really strikes you is how bright these people are and how committed they are. And I think the challenge actually for leaders is cutting all of these bureaucratic sinews so that people are free to find their own solution. And the work is really not a recipe, do these things. What I've tried to do is pinpoint really good solutions from players and explain why they're good. But the sheer talent in media organizations is extraordinary. You get really top-level people going in there, very intelligent people, and they are deeply committed. But often, to date, their skills have been limited to solving the journalistic problem. And what you see, the organizations that are moving ahead are using those that sheer, talent of the people to actually solve the big issue. And the person who put this best to me was, Marty Barron of Washington Post, who's a truly great leader. And he said, I just say to my people, you are journalists, you are great investigative journalists. You cannot afford to try and solve problems in society and ignore the profound problem in our industry. It behoves you to try and solve this organizational challenge as well, because otherwise we won't be able to do what we love doing. And what I saw in stronger organizations was a variant of that, essentially. And the problem, I think, for media and journalism is we've been slightly allergic to management, to organization. We're very allergic to jargon. We hate management jargon. We don't like consultants. And that's why language is really, really critical in culture change. And it's really important organizations find their own solutions, but it is about harnessing everyone's energies and trying to solve this.
Thank you. Hello, my name is John Crowley. I'm a freelance journalist, but I have worked at several legacy news organisations, so I'm getting lots of flashbacks from this excellent
PTSD.
panel. One thing that I think will have chimed with lots of people in this room is what you said, Lucy. Having 30 years of experience does not necessarily equate to being the right person to bring about cultural change. So I'm going to talk about people right at the top of the organisation, but people right at the top who may talk the talk but don't walk the walk, so to speak. Yeah. So we're talking about training younger kind of journalists, bringing them on. How do we cajole, inspire and train the leaders right at the top without getting sacked?
Do you want to take it? Okay, I'll take it. I have a lot to say on this, but I would again say, and there's an element of this going on at the BBC at the moment, is audience data is really powerful, especially at the corporate top. So, nearly 2 years ago, I was banging on about the female audience, the young. Everybody will know Fiona talks about the female, the young, and the less well-off. But in what I've noticed corporately is now the BBC, now they have a slogan called Reinventing for the Next Generation. So across the whole of the BBC, they have done a huge data crunching on the younger audience consumption, which obviously affects us all. And there has been, and that data, that pan BBC data reality check that's landed in recent months has totally changed, I think, the top level vibe. It's created that dissatisfaction, that sense of, right, we need to get on this now and we need to align. And I've watched that happen, and I thought, let's see what happens. And actually now it has hit news, because news tend to be very cynical and they kind of do whatever the hell they want anyway. But now it's hit news, and they are and now the messaging is focusing, and the meetings are changing, the composition of meetings are changing, and it's all driven by this pan-organisation data that they got out that showed them about under 34 consumption patterns. So you've got to get something that's an existential threat to the people at the top as the people at the top, and then you've got to lever that hard. Yeah.
Hey, it's James Morgan from CrowdTangle. Fiona, I was in the room when you became the controller, and the whole of the BBC squeezed in to see the new mobile and online controller unveil the strategy, and you asked a really powerful question, which always stayed with me. You said, what is the thing that we can all do less of, and must do less of, to make room for all these new exciting ideas? And so I kind of wanted to ask all of the panel, what have you asked your teams and organizations to stop doing that they might actually have liked doing, were comfortable doing, and would have been quite happy to go on doing, to make room for all the new things? And how did you get them to stop?
I can actually, I said earlier that it's very difficult to fire people in Sweden because of the laws. So you to get change, you need to do different things. But what we have done twice the last 7 years is that we actually made reorganizations where everyone had to reapply for their jobs, even management. So you are safe. You will be an employee always, but you might not be able to do what you're doing now forever. And this has created a flexibility, but also now people are getting a bit used to the fact that this will not go on. We will soon change again. We will need to adapt again. This is something that will be normal, and also the changing the culture in how you look at careers has been very important. Now we have some really brilliant people that used to be leaders, managers, that for a few years come and be a fantastic reporter again, and then can move back into management. So that kind of unprestigious atmosphere is very important.
Exits are really important because everyone has resource scarcity now. Everyone has too much to do, too little money. And it's really important. They're really much harder than you think. It's very difficult and painful to shut things down, close things down. And you need precedent. It's really important taking a few painless things just to show this is something we do in the organization. It doesn't mean a nuclear level change. This organization from time to time pulls out of areas, closes projects. You need to kind of normalize it. Because otherwise there simply are not the resources to cover all the bases that need to be covered. And the world is changing fast. There will be new skills, and I mean investments in things like AI are massive if they're going to work. So, and you need energy and attention for that. So normalize pulling out of areas, make it less sensitive.
And just to your point about how do you get them to stop, choose a couple of things that they hate doing. So we're about to allow some of our guys to stop doing a piece of work that they have bitched and moaned about for since I joined, a long time. And they're about to get to stop doing it. And they are so happy about it. It's something that a machine should have been able to do a long time ago, now a machine can. Essentially bringing together a schedule for our media clients saying what's coming up. And we now have a new piece of technology, planning technology, and so you can now get the machine to do the majority of it, double check it as a human being and send it off. And it will save, I don't know, probably about 20 hours a day around the world. So kill some of the things that they don't want to do, and then when you have the data to prove that other stuff isn't resonating, they might be happier to get on with it.
Hello, I'm Jo Fay. I'm Deputy Head of Multimedia, co-lead social media at the International Service of the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation. My question was, how do you keep the momentum going after you've done training sessions or you spent a month with a team? Obviously, you can't constantly monitor hundreds or thousands of people. So how do you keep that momentum going after the initial phase?
So if I can just pick up off the back of our month-long pilot process that I've been banging on about, we had a lot of discussion about evolving that, and at the end of it, there is another away day with that team, where the team commit to what changes in working practices or changes in content they're going to stick with. So they literally have to write a new mission statement, and then that is there is one of that crack team I was telling you about, one of that 6, stays in regular contact with them and continues to go to their meetings, continues to follow up, which has recently just escalated into 1 year on. We have another away day and we bring to them an analysis deep dive of how their stats have changed 1 year on. And their leader gives a presentation on, from their point of view, what has changed. And I was looking back on some of those on the way here, and for all of them, the engagement time has increased, the recirculation has increased. Some things haven't done so well, so one team hadn't done so well on SEO improvement, but the fact is they all had improved in some things, and the content decisions that they were making were now completely different from a year hence. But so it's really important you do have a path of follow-up and continuing communication and continuing support afterwards, because otherwise it will all just drop away. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question.
No, we don't.
We don't have time for questions. Oh, Okay.
Okay.
In that case, my watch is wrong.
Okay.
So have we stopped the stream? Just to understand? Yeah? Okay, brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thank you.
I'm sure we have 5 more minutes. I'm sure we have 5 more minutes.